This is CheloniaCast, episode 61. Today we are joined by Dr. Pamela Plotkin, who's a former associate research professor in the Department of Oceanography at Texas A&M University. She was also the former director of the Texas Sea Grant College program and is a current member of the IUCN Sea Turtle Survival Commission. Uh, Dr. Plotkin has studied sea turtles in a variety of respects, from their conservation to movement and biology. She's also edited the great sort of compilation project, the biology and conservation of Ridley sea turtles, and has published very extensively on the arribada phenomenon. And so we're really excited to talk to her today about some of her research with these really fascinating turtles. So thanks for coming on, Dr. Plotkin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Awesome. Well, we like to start out with sort of exploring how you kind of got interested in turtles and how your sort of academic pursuits in turtles evolved. But what first got you interested in turtles and sea turtles?
So when I was an undergraduate at Penn State University, State College, Pennsylvania, I was a wildlife science major. And I very much wanted to get some experience either in the lab or in the field working with a professor there. But nobody had any undergraduate research experiences back then. That was the early 1980s, and that just wasn't as popular as it is today. And so I started looking elsewhere for volunteer opportunities and internships. And I came across a opportunity advertised by a group known as the Student Conservation Association, the SCA. And they were placing young college-age kids in national parks across the country to do everything from work in interpretive divisions to doing biological research. And so they sent me a nice little packet of information about all the opportunities they had. And I was allowed to select my top three choices for volunteering. And my first choice was to go work in Michigan at Isle Royale National Park, studying wolves because I was fascinated by wolf behavior at the time. My second choice was going to Northern California to work with wild horses. I believe that was with the Bureau of Land Management. And then my third choice was going to work at the Padre Island National Seashore in Texas with the Kemp's Ridley Sea Turtle Recovery and Enhancement Program. And so I didn't get selected for the wolf project, and I didn't get selected for the horse project, but I got a call from the Padre Island National Seashore, and they invited me to come down and work there for the summer. So the SCA provided me with a bus ticket. I took a bus from New York City down to Corpus Christi, Texas, and the park put me up in a trailer on the beach, and I spent the summer there learning everything I could about sea turtles. And what I learned was that there were more questions than there were answers, and I just became enamored with the whole Kemp's Ridley sea turtle story. It was back then a species that was very close to extinction. The binational program was a multi-agency effort to recover the species. And so eggs were flown from Mexico to Texas to try to develop a second nesting colony in the event that something happened to the primary nesting colony in Mexico. And so I had the opportunity to help incubate the eggs that summer and help the hatchlings crawl down the beach and into the water. And at that point, we were transporting those hatchlings up to Galveston, Texas, to the NOAA Galveston lab, where they would grow for almost a year before they were returned back into the Gulf of Mexico as larger juvenile turtles that supposedly would be able to survive to adulthood once they had grown and were not as susceptible to predation. So it was really an amazing experience, and that was what hooked me, was that summer research opportunity, and it carried me throughout my lifetime. That one great experience.
Right. That's a really interesting and kind of a cool first project to kind of get involved with. That's to work with a species that was in such a sort of dire conservation situation. What was the nesting of the Kemp's Ridley like on the Texas coast when you first started working there versus how it is now in terms of numbers and sort of distribution?
So the first documented Kemp's Ridley nesting in Texas occurred in the 1940s. They were never very abundant there, but there also wasn't good documentation, and so every year after then, I shouldn't say every year after then, but throughout the 1970s and 80s and 90s, there were at least one to as many as 6 or 7 Kemp's Ridley sea turtles documented nesting on the Texas coast. And it really wasn't until there were dedicated systematic searches for Kemp's Ridley on the Texas coast that we started learning about increasing numbers of sea turtles nesting in that region. And so if you look at the Texas coast, the areas where we find Kemp's Ridley's nesting are pretty remote areas where there isn't a lot of there aren't a lot of roads, there aren't a lot of development, and the only way to access some of these beaches is with a four-wheel drive vehicle. So that's part of the reason why these areas were not well surveyed. And once they were systematically surveyed, more and more turtles were found every year. And now it's to the point where there are several hundred that are nesting every year. Somewhere between 200 and 300 seems to be about the number that we find on Texas beaches. And it seems to be increasing steadily every year.
Right. That seems like it's a good sign. And that sort of stemmed from, as you mentioned, I mean, in when you got involved with this project, it was at a certain stage of that, and I think it was around 1978 where it was sort of found that in Rancho Nuevo and where they sort of nest in high abundance, the Kemp's Ridleys, that population was really in a bad situation with only a few hundred turtles perhaps nesting there. And so that was kind of this whole process. And now you've got enough of them at that beach that they're starting to nest elsewhere. I mean, is that sort of the logical way to think about it, or?
I think so. There's definitely what we see in Ridley turtles, range expansion. And so you have typically a beach or several beaches where they become abundant, and then you see expansion. And in one of the chapters of my book, Peter Pritchard wrote very eloquently about the arribadas he has known, and he suggested that there was this natural evolution to the nesting beaches for Ridleys, and that they reached some sort of peak abundance, and then they started to move elsewhere after they reached that peak abundance. And we're certainly seeing that with Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. We've got the expansion into Texas, and we've got the expansion into other states in the Gulf of Mexico as well as the Atlantic. So every year we're seeing more and more Kemp's Ridleys nesting in other places where they never used to nest before.
Would you say the situation is a conservation success story?
Oh, I think it's the best conservation success story there is for an endangered species.
Wow.
Of any kind. And, it's not, the story's not finished. So I want to be real careful and say that the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle is not recovered. However, it is not the in the same critical state it was when I first started working with Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. As you mentioned, in 1978, it was in such dire straits that they started that binational recovery program. And it was a last-ditch effort because scientists didn't know what to do. And so, a small number of eggs were flown to Texas. And that occurred for 10 years through 1988. But really, the other efforts that occurred coincidentally were more important. And the first one was protecting the nesting beach from illegal egg take. That was hugely important to the conservation success. And then secondarily, the mandatory use of turtle excluder devices on shrimp boats working in the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic, which came into force around 89, 90, was significant. And so those two actions were really what saved the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle and other species as well. And so we went from just a few hundred nesting females at Rancho Nuevo, Mexico in the late 80s, early 90s to an estimated 10,000 females last month nesting on one day at Rancho Nuevo. So, that's amazing in my opinion. And that it happened in my lifetime is thrilling, and it's because of the dedication of thousands of people who have worked on the beaches and worked to get their legislators to pass federal laws that require turtle excluder devices, and lots of other people who have played substantial roles and even just minor roles too, because it all has added up. And it's to me it's a great story about how two countries work together to with shared goals to save a species.
Right. Yeah, I think that part of it is really inspiring. It's sort of, yeah, in terms of one objective, so many people and in different areas sort of came together to make a difference in the conservation of that species, which is totally necessary. That in a situation like that, one party can't control the whole situation. So yeah, really a fascinating thing. Have you spent time at Rancho Nuevo, and if so, what was that like?
Yeah, I was there once in 1990, and it was at the beginning of my dissertation research. I was en route to Costa Rica to live there for 6 months. And so I went to Rancho Nuevo to learn how to attach satellite transmitters to sea turtles. And so it was a great opportunity, though, to go to the nesting beach, which I had never experienced before. And at that time, there were only a few hundred females that were believed to be nesting on that beach. And the day after I arrived, the arribada began. And back then, the arribada consisted of a few dozen turtles. And what was so cool, though, was even though it was just a few dozen turtles, they were all synchronized and they were all spread out across, I want to say maybe about 10 miles of beach. And the synchronicity of it was still existent, even though they weren't densely packed on a beach. And to me, that was just a great observation that I had the opportunity to see myself, because that behavior was not necessarily apparently density dependent. And So I got to see, I think, just 4 or 5 turtles that day because I had to help attach transmitters to them, and it took quite some time to work up just one turtle. And but it was a thrill of a lifetime. And I haven't been back, and it's unfortunately it's in an area that is challenging to travel to because of some of the crime in the area, and it's just not as safe as it was back in 1990. You wouldn't want to get in a car and drive from Texas to Mexico like we did back then, and do it as freely as we did.
Right. Yeah, we spoke with Sybil Pritchard on a previous discussion, and she told us stories from going there, and just some of the things even when she was going that were sort of that you had to be careful. There was a point when she got left behind in their group and was waiting for over a day and just the middle of that beach, and a lot of interesting encounters out there and such. But it just seems like
I bet.
it seems like an incredible location, and yeah, the presence of the Kemp's Ridleys there is fascinating. Um, I think you bring up an interesting point with the Arribada, and perhaps we can sort of discuss that in a second. But with the Kemp's Ridley, you've been involved in the stock assessment for this species and sort of this large scale collaboration to better understand the population dynamics and trajectory. And I'm curious what it's like, if not just to see that many people come together to develop a model for sort of looking at the population trends and making management recommendations. I mean, what is that process like?
Well, first of all, I need to provide a disclaimer. I am not a modeler and don't pretend to be, but I have contributed to projects with modelers. And so, I think that models are great ways to assess, and really the only way we have to assess species like Ridley sea turtles. And it's, the modelers often disagree with the models. So,
Right.
I know I worked with a great team of folks, and we tried to do a stock assessment, and a lot of people had who are professional modelers didn't like our model and had problems with it. And so it'll be interesting to see, in the next set of status reviews that the government publishes, which models they will go with and use to project the status of Kemp's Ridleys and other species as well. And I think they're in the process of doing that with Kemp's Ridley now.
Well, yeah, that's a good thing, and I guess it's something that's progressively going to sort of improve and change with time. There's never really a fixed. I guess that's whole kind of with the model concept is you can never perfect it. It's always just trying to approximate. But that's a good thing for that species. Um, Perhaps we can sort of transition into talking about the Arribada phenomenon in general. And I think the best way to open that up would just be to say, what is it? I mean, how do you define it?
Yeah, so it's definitely has not been well defined, and has been defined in different ways by different people. But I think that the consistent definition or elements of the definition have been that it's a simultaneous nesting aggregation, and in one location or maybe in multiple locations, and the actual number of nesters or turtles in that aggregation that signify an Arribada has been defined differently by different people. So some people will say it has to be 100 turtles in order to be an arribada, or it has to be 1,000 turtles in order to be an arribada. And so my story earlier, when we were talking about Kemp's Ridley, there were clearly less than 100 turtles nesting the day I was at Rancho Nuevo, yet there were still dozens of turtles that came up on the same beach at the same time. And to me, that was an arribada, and to everybody else, that was an arribada. So it really, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. But I think that the one thing we can all agree on is that it is a asynchronous mass emergence. Just what that mass is up for debate. So there's little consensus on that spatial and temporal boundaries that define the arribada. It could be, a 1 kilometer beach like the one I did most of my research at, Nancite, Costa Rica, or it could be, 20 kilometers or more. So in my opinion, it's that synchronous emergence, and it doesn't really matter how many turtles there are. I'd say, if you said I saw 5 turtles coming up at one time, I wouldn't define that as an arribada. So it's pretty subjective.
That's interesting, the synchronicity aspect of it and the importance of that. It's that raises a lot of questions in terms of the evolution and just how the behavior actually happens. But maybe we could start out that sort of area with the question of why is it that we don't see this in other species of sea turtles and then it's restricted to Lepidochelys?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, and I in my book, I think in the very beginning of it, I point out that that is the defining behavior of the Ridleys, and we still don't understand why they do it and other species do not. And I don't think we're any closer to that today than we were when my book was published in 2007. But another, very interesting thing I want to point out is that not all Ridleys nest in arribadas. And so if you look at the olive Ridley and the ones that I studied in the East Pacific along the coast of Costa Rica, those Ridleys are sometimes nesting during arribadas. Some of those Ridleys are nesting as solitary nesting turtles. And there's also a mixed strategy where some of the Ridleys are sometimes nesting in arribadas and sometimes nesting solitarily. And then there's a lot of mixing of beaches going on in the solitary nesting turtles, as well as those that are in the mixed strategy. So the arribada turtles seem to have very strong nest site fidelity. So if you're an arribada turtle and you're always an arribada turtle, you're going to be going back to one beach most of the time. There may be some switching between arribada beaches, and that has been recorded in Costa Rica. So sometimes the arribada turtle will nest during an arribada at Nancite, and then a couple of months later, or the next month later, may nest at the arribada in Ostianal. And that seems to be uncommon, but it occurs. And then there's the solitary nesters who have very low site fidelity to a nesting beach. They may nest at any beach across Central America. And so one of the students who was trained in the same lab I was and did her research down at Nancite Beach was studying solitary nesting turtles and their movements and behavior. And she found that some of the solitary turtles that would come to nest at Nancite would later be found in places like Nicaragua or Panama. So that was really cool because what we then hypothesized was that there was, A, less site fidelity, B, there was a strategy there where females were not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak, at one arribada beach. They were moving around and putting their eggs at multiple beaches. And in fact, others have have confirmed that behavior in solitary nesting turtles using satellite telemetry. So there are two strategies. And then in between those two strategies, there's that mixed strategy. So, we have yet to even quantify that behavior. How many solitary nesters are there out there? How many are employing that mixed strategy? And so those are all really great opportunities for students to study for dissertations and master's thesis research, and I'm hopeful that in my lifetime we'll see more people looking at some of those questions that remain regarding the alternative reproductive tactics of olive ridley turtles, and which ones. Well, I won't even say which ones are more successful, but when are each of those different strategies successful, right? So, or if you're a solitary nester and, it's a El Nino year, is that a good strategy versus being an arribada nester? So, yeah, lots of questions there that bring in oceanographic influences and weather influences too, and then of course there's always a lot of what I'll call interspecific competition
Right.
that influences the nesting beach significantly. So, when you think about an arribada beach in a place like Nansite that's only 1 kilometer long, if you've got 150,000 turtles nesting on that beach and they're doing it over the course of 7 nights, you see a lot of density dependent mortality of eggs because there's only so much space where a female can dig her nest. And so often you see females digging up nests of other females that were laid on previous nights. And so that density dependent mortality, certainly plays a role. And so there are just so many different things that come into play, as well as predation, right? So there was a nice study that was done back when I was working at Nansite, Costa Rica, by an undergraduate who joined our lab, and she was looking at the hatching success of olive ridley nests on Nansite Beach, and she was comparing the arribada nests with the solitary nests, and she found that the arribada nests were producing more hatchlings than the solitary nests. And you'd expect that because it's an arribada beach, there's a high density of predators that are living in that dry tropical forest adjacent to the beach.
Right.
And so if you're a solitary turtle coming out by yourself, those predators can easily cue in on you and dig up your nest. And if you're an arribada nesting turtle, your nest is out there with thousands of others. So there's a little bit of security in that, somebody else's eggs might be eaten by the predators. So, one would expect that. And then there have been some studies on solitary nesting beaches that have shown that the solitary nesting turtles on solitary nesting beaches have fairly high productivity. And so there's not, high density of predators on those beaches often. Sometimes there is. And so there's still a ton of work that needs to be done. Exploring those reproductive tactics and trying to understand, how they evolved, why they evolved, and, how they're maintained.
It's fascinating to think about, sort of, as you're talking about the solitary versus arribada nesters. It seems like and now going forward, I think it's important to point out that we're mostly referring to the olive ridley.
Correct.
And the Kemp's is unique in the sense that it's restricted to one site, whereas olive ridleys this arribada phenomenon is pretty global in terms of expanse.
Yeah.
And we can touch upon that. But it's interesting to think about the fact that a lot of turtles have this sort of natal homing and go back to the same site to nest, whereas you get the extremes with the ridleys. You'll have the arribada nesters that come back en masse to the same area, and the solitary nesters that are almost nomadic, it seems like. I mean, do you see any of the natal homing at all in the solitary nesters, or is it they're all nomadic?
I don't know the answer to that question. Um, I'm not sure there's been enough years of study at solitary nesting beaches that have followed turtles, solitary turtles, year after year after year, if they're the same turtles or not. Um, there, there are some solitary nesting beaches that have been fairly well studied in Costa Rica by a colleague of mine, Randall Arauz, and they're a little further south than Ostianal and Nancite, and I don't know what his data look like in terms of the solitary nesting turtles and whether they recover them and find fidelity to those beaches or not.
Well, it's sort of an interesting open question, I guess. And yeah. Um, with regard to the history, like I mentioned prior to recording, I spent some time at Ostianal this past November, and I sort of initially was looking for a lot of historical data there, and I was kind of surprised to learn that the phenomenon there is relatively recently documented in a sort of long-term scale. And maybe you could expand upon the history at that site and other sites and what's known about when the arribada first started in different localities, and who are some of the early players in discovering and sort of elucidating things about the arribada.
So the arribada phenomenon has long been known to indigenous people in the areas where those arribadas occurred. And it was first reported for olive ridleys from Suriname in the Western Atlantic and from the Pacific coast of Mexico by Peter Pritchard in the 60s. With the discovery of, the arribadas in Costa Rica occurring in the early 1970s by a fellow by the name of Richard Hughes. And then the northern Indian Ocean sites really only coming to light in the mid-70s, again by Peter Pritchard. So in terms of timescales, these are pretty not frequent, but recent phenomena that it's been known to the scientific community. If you look at Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, it was the 1960s, and there was a famous film that was recorded in 1947 at Rancho Nuevo, Mexico. And I believe it was an engineer who was interested in flying in beaches who happened upon an arribada and filmed a mass nesting there in 1947. And a fellow by the name of Henry Hildebrand, who was a professor in Texas, came across that film and showed it at a herpetology conference in Austin, Texas, and really just blew everybody's mind when that film was shown in the 1960s. And so by then the number of sea turtles at Rancho Nuevo had already declined significantly, but really it wasn't until the 1960s that arribada phenomenon came to light for Kemp's Ridley. So that's kind of the history of it. Now, for Ostianal, if you talk to a lot of the older folks, you get different stories about, when they first saw an arribada there. And I think the most consistent story I heard was that it wasn't until the 1980s, I believe it was the 1980s, might have been the 1970s, that they first started seeing arribadas there, but that they had not occurred there previously. So yeah, it's unfortunate that there isn't more information available at OCNL. And I know that when I first got to Costa Rica, there was a research station there. It was called the Douglas Robinson Research Station. It may still be called that. And Douglas Robinson was one of the first scientists to study olive ridleys in Costa Rica. And they named that station after him after he passed. And he was just a wealth of information because he had lived in Costa Rica most of his adult life and had studied the sea turtles there and had spoken to many folks who were indigenous folks living in those areas for decades. And so with him went a lot of information as well. And some of that information is in his unpublished reports that are probably not widely available, but still around.
Well, yeah, the account of sort of the 1960, the Austin meeting where the footage was sort of revealed is fascinating to think about, especially with respect to the fact that the olive Ridley phenomenon, that's I think more widely known perhaps than the Kemp's Ridley phenomenon, was not as well documented in sort of the typical prime scientific literature at that point. So this was the first time the world had seen anything like this, and that's really fascinating.
Yeah. Imagine how exciting it must have been for people who were searching for Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. And Archie Carr, probably the most famous of all the sea turtle biologists, was out there searching for them. And so was Henry Hildebrand from Texas on down to Mexico. So for them to witness that after years of searching just must have been a thrill of a lifetime.
Well, and it's interesting too how they sort of got in contact with you mentioned an engineer, so that was the person who discovered it. It's a testament to the fact that connections with people matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the people who live in an area every day and live with the animals that are going to be really the most informative for scientists. And I always relied on fishermen, for example, to give me information about where the sea turtles were out in the ocean, because they were living on the water every day and they knew when the turtles would come in and where the turtles were when they weren't near the beach, and they were just a wealth of information. And then the local people who lived in communities like OCNL were very tuned into what the turtles were doing and when they were doing it. And OCNL is a unique place because the people rely on the sea turtles for part of their income. And there's a cooperative there. I don't know if you were able to meet any of the people who work in the cooperative, but they harvest some of the eggs there during the first night of the arribada, and some of those eggs go into market in OCNL as well as other parts of the country, and are sold legally in Costa Rica. And they feel like they are good stewards of the sea turtles, and they clean the beaches and they watch out for the eggs. They watch over the hatchlings when they're returning to ocean. They feel a very strong connection to the turtles because of that heritage and history.
Right. Yeah, I was fortunate to be able to talk to one of the leaders of at least the guide, the Association de Guías, while I was there, and it was interesting just to sort of get his opinion on a lot of the history of the phenomenon there, and the hatchlings and the evolution of that event. Um, Perhaps we could talk a bit about some of the work you did at Nansite, which is, I think, probably globally a lesser known arribada spot, and that is recently, as I understand it, has been sort of changing. But maybe you could talk a bit about what it was like to work there and what you learned about the movement of olive ridleys at that location.
Yeah. So that was probably the best experience I've ever had in my life. Nansite is located in the Guanacaste National Park, formerly known as the Santa Rosa National Park. And it's a huge dry tropical forest. The dry tropical forest is one of the most endangered ecosystems, and it's a park that is known for its diversity, wealth of resources, and is a very well-funded park, in part because a very famous ecologist by the name of Dr. Dan Jansen has attracted a lot of attention there by pioneering forest reforestation in the dry tropical forest, by buying a lot of land for the park, raising the funds to buy that land, training the local people to be parataxonomists and to get engaged in the land there. So it's a great place to work, and Nansite is a very remote location, so you can't drive there, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Because that has certainly saved that place from development, whereas there are a lot of places now that are very highly developed along the coast there. You've got to, during the dry part of the season, you can drive down to the base of the mountain and then climb over the mountain and down into the valley and down to Nansite Beach. It's not for the faint of heart. You've got to be in pretty good physical condition to do that hike. If you don't have a car, it's about a 5.5-hour hike each way. And so once you get there, there's no electricity, and you do have water, which is great. You've got a field station, and it's primitive. And so it's a challenging place to work because of all those things. You spend a lot more time doing things like cooking and getting water and all that sort of stuff, and you don't have concierge services available.
Right.
And so that part of the experience was fabulous because you're living in the wild, and there are monkeys, there are crocodiles, there are snakes, there are scorpions, there's all sorts of wonderful things, and now there's a blossoming jaguar population there too.
Yeah.
So it's a great place to work, and because it's only a kilometer long, you don't have a long stretch of beach that you need to walk up and down to find turtles. They're right there for you. And so that part was easy. But we also worked in the water as well, and we had a small boat that we would take out into the Gulf of Papagayo, is the body of water there, and we would catch turtles and bring them on the boat. Sometimes we would bring them back to the beach for experiments, or to attach transmitters to, or to ultrasound, collect blood from. We did all sorts of things. We had, I think, 3 or 4 different graduate student projects going at one time. And so my part of the project was, I was interested in learning about their migrations to and from the beach, but more specifically, I wanted to understand if there was a social dimension to their migration. And so a lot of marine animals migrate in groups. Whales migrate in pods, fish migrate in schools. And there was this long-standing hypothesis that the sea turtles that nested in arribadas were migrating to the beach together, marching up the beach together, and then leaving the beach together as well. And if you watch an arribada closely enough and long enough, you'll see that, in fact, there are these waves of females that come up on the beach. You may see 5, 6, 7, 8 turtles that all seem to hit the beach at the same time and lay their eggs in the same area. And so visually, it looked like they might be traveling in groups.
Right.
And then at some arribada beaches, and one in particular I'm thinking about in India, there were scientists who were putting tags, little cow ear tags on the flippers of turtles, which is how people have marked sea turtles for decades. And they found that if they marked or tagged a group of those turtles that emerged at the same time and in the same location, that they would find them reemerging together in subsequent arribadas and in subsequent years. So that added more evidence to the hypothesis that sea turtles that were emerging as groups were a social group of some sort. And so my project focused on finding groups of turtles like those described in the literature, and putting satellite transmitters on them and tracking them until the next arribada. So I was looking for females that would come up and lay their eggs and still had another clutch remaining in them. And that's why I used an ultrasound machine, was to verify that. These females were early in the reproductive season. They typically lay at Nancy Day 2 clutches per female. So if I got a group of turtles in June, I'd know they'd be coming back in July with the ultrasonography results. And so I cued in on those groups, and I tried to find females that were in a tightly knit group that had emerged together, laid their eggs, and were all going to be returning. I'd attach satellite transmitters to that group, and then we'd let them go. And we'd track them during the internesting period. We'd recapture them during the next arribada. And then we'd let them go off on their migration after that second nesting. So I had incredible success, particularly my first year, captured a group of turtles. They went off into the Gulf of Papagayo after they had their satellite transmitters attached to them. And this was the coolest thing that happened. No turtles. So this was September of 1990. And I had, I believe it was 6 or 7 turtles, I can't remember exactly. In that group, first group of turtles, I put transmitters on, and they left Nancy Day Beach after the September arribada. And shortly after that arribada, it started raining. And it was the most rain I've ever seen in my life. It rained every day, nonstop. Wow. And dry riverbeds became raging rivers, and it just never stopped. And mushrooms were growing on our clothes, and it was a little depressing after a while, because it was just soggy every day. And we expected turtles to return 30 days later in October for an October arribada, but no turtles came for an arribada. We had a lot of turtles that crawled up on the beach, and they'd go up to the dunes area, and then they'd just turn around and go back into the water. And that beach was saturated. And in fact, rivers had actually broken through the beach in multiple spots. There was so much water coming down off the mountains. So not any nesting occurred in October, and my transmitters all had pressure sensors. And so I knew from my transmitters that my turtles were not doing a lot of diving, and my turtles were just pretty much inactive. And so they were all hanging out in the Gulf of Papagayo, just waiting. And in November, I think it was the first or second week in November, it finally stopped raining. And the arribada started, and all my turtles showed back up. They emerged at the same time in the same area with their transmitters still functioning. And I recaptured all of them, got another ultrasound scan, got another blood sample. And then after that, they all began their post-nesting migration. And all 6 or 7 turtles went into different directions, from as far north as Mexico to as far as Peru to as far west as just 2,000 kilometers west of Costa Rica out in the Pacific Ocean. So it was pretty cool to see that phenomenon delayed by too much rain. And at that point, I was so interested in what cues initiated the arribada that there I was seeing an arribada basically not occur because of the rain. So whatever that rain did, it masked those cues that those females used to initiate the arribada. They were still in the area. They were all still there in the Gulf of Papagayo, but none of them were nesting, and they delayed oviposition and held on to the eggs. And that was also pretty cool too, was, the whole delayed oviposition part of it, because they were ready to dump those eggs in October, but they held on until November. So it was really cool. That was a magical field season for me. And then I had a couple of more field seasons after that were also very productive, but not quite as magical as that one.
That is fascinating, and thinking about, right. Sometimes not seeing something occur is the best type of data, in the absence of the event. It sort of tells you a lot about what could be causing it. And so,
yeah. And the thing I forgot to tell you, which is absolutely the coolest part of it, when those turtles came back to nest in November, they showed up about 24 hours before the arribada began. And I had heard about this before, but I had never actually witnessed it. And it was a calm day, no winds, just flat water with incredible visibility. And someone who was living at the field camp came running back to the house and said, "There's thousands of turtle heads popping up in the water. And grab your fins, grab your mask, grab your snorkel." So we all grabbed our snorkeling gear and ran out to the beach and got in the water and started swimming with the turtles. And it was the most amazing thing I've ever done. I swam with thousands of olive ridley turtles, and they were more interested in me than I was in them, which was also pretty cool. They'd swim up to me and kind of glide by me and come back and check me out again. And some of them were just hunkered on the bottom, just kind of hanging out and resting. Some were swimming. And it was just, a magical few hours of swimming with thousands of sea turtles. And then as the sun went down, they started crawling up the beach and laying their eggs. So that was pretty cool too. So at that point, and after my several field seasons, I was certain that there was no sort of tight-knit pod-like group that migrated to the beach and left the beach together. But what I couldn't rule out was that there wasn't some sort of social facilitation that occurs at the beach when they all gather, and that there's something that triggers it. And it may be a density dependent trigger. It may be something else. I don't know what it is. But clearly at some point they all get the cue and they all hit the beach at the same time. And that is really cool.
Well, that does sort of beg that question of what causes it, if it isn't a social event. And even if it was a social event, you'd think there's some kind of overarching kind of pull to the nesting beach, because you wouldn't assume that you'd have 200, 300,000 sea turtles traveling together. They'd be in groups. So there's something that brings them all back to the beach, which of course could just be that same cue that is driving other sea turtles to their natal beaches and that sort of thing. But if it isn't a socially facilitated event that is sort of instigated by a lot of the similar magnetoreception, the things that drive other sea turtles to the beach, and that's not fully understood. But then what is it? I mean, is it the tides, the moon? Is it a mixture of different variables? Is this sort of a compound effect? Is that why it's been so hard to sort of to pinpoint an exact drive of the phenomenon?
That's a good question. The only thing that folks can agree on, and that you see agreement on in the scientific literature, is that it most frequently occurs during third quarter moon at most beaches, but not all beaches. And so, yeah, that's about as good as it gets. I know that there have been some recent graduate student research projects that have focused in on that question at OSTNL, and I don't know what the results of that research is at this time, and I know that they're still working on the publications, but Dr. Ken Lohman at the University of North Carolina and his team were down at OSTNL for a few years. And Ken, of course, is one of the leading researchers in magnetoreception. And so, I don't know the status of the work he and his students did there, and look forward to learning more about it. But I believe that the most recent publication they have from that work is the only environmental variable they could find a strong association with was the lunar cycle.
That is, yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, it isn't always constant. I was there around the third quarter moon, and there was no sign of it, and no other issues with rain or anything like that. So it does seem like there's some level of, I always wonder how much of it is kind of a calculation that takes into account of a lot of different things, and how close are we to really understanding even the first part of what drives it.
Yeah. For Kemp's ridley sea turtle, there's definitely an association with wind, and so at certain times of the year, their winds are much stronger, and that's about it. And so, I was really interested to see if there was a wind association in the Eastern Pacific, and I didn't find that. So, yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. Also, great opportunities for graduate students to look a little deeper and try to uncover the mystery of arribada timing and how it's maintained.
It's really interesting. You mentioned earlier, maybe we could touch on this just a bit, but the sort of the egg harvest and the cooperative at OSTNL. I'm just curious, that can be a bit controversial. I'm curious what you think about that.
So that's a very controversial subject, as you mentioned, and I will be honest with you and tell you that in 1990, when I first went to OSTNL, I was very much against the egg harvest there. And I really knew nothing about it, and I had never been there. And, back in those days, there weren't super highways to get to OSTNL, so it was a bit of a journey to get there. I think some of us crossed the river on horse, and others just did it walking across, swimming across, and it was a lot of fun, and it was a lot smaller back then, the town of OSTNL, and there certainly weren't that many visitors there, and there was just a small town with a cooperative, and I think they had just brought in electricity and a little medical clinic to the area. And so I got there, and I met some local folks, and I sat down and talked to them, and they told me about their families and what their families do as part of the cooperative, and what the town does to embrace the turtles, and they took me out to the beach, and I saw them harvesting the eggs, and spoke to a lot of people, and my mind was changed very quickly because these people I met were so in tune with their environment and those turtles and loved them that it was hard to think anything other than very positive things about the people and their stewardship of that resource. They knew that if they took too many eggs, that would be bad for the turtles, and so they controlled themselves and watched over those turtles as if they were their own children. And so I was completely changed by that experience and realized that here I was, a gringa from originally New York City, coming to another country, judging something that had been going on for decades in a sustainable way, and was kind of ashamed that I had felt the way I had felt. And so that was really a life-changing moment for me to not judge people for their cultural, historical uses of sea turtles and other animals. And it's no different than, some of the things that we do here in this country. So that was life-changing, and I since then have been a proponent of the egg harvest and indigenous use of wildlife. I think it's important. I think it certainly can be harmful to populations when it occurs unchecked. And I think that it's certainly not unchecked at OSDNL. I think there are great controls in place to ensure the sustainability of that harvest and the turtles. And I think that's a model program. Yeah, so I again, most of my experience was at Nancy Day and secondarily at OSDNL, both located in Costa Rica. And then, of course, I did one visit to the Kimberly Beach in Northeast Mexico, Rancho Nuevo, Mexico. I also visited on two occasions the Arribada beaches in India, the state of Orissa, and was hoping to work there. And unfortunately, my permit was denied by the Indian government. And so I had I think about a dozen satellite transmitters I was going to put on turtles there and track them in the Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean, and never had the opportunity to do that, unfortunately, because the beach where I was going to do the work was located adjacent to a missile test site.
Oh.
And so, it became a little controversial. They thought, my transmitters were going to collect sensitive information that would jeopardize their national security. And so I never did get to my research in India, and never got to see an Arribada in India either. And so that really was sad for me, because I was really, I was following in Peter Pritchard's footsteps. I wanted to go to every Arribada beach and study every Arribada beach there was, and I never had that opportunity. So I think, getting back to your question, why do some increase and others decline? And I think that in Peter's chapter in my book, he nicely lays out his thoughts on that, and that is that it's just the evolution of an Arribada beach, right? So turtles find a place. It's a good nesting location, and they are successful at that beach, and it reaches some some sort of density that is way too high for that beach, and then there is low survivability of eggs and hatchlings, and the turtles move on to another beach. And that certainly seems to be the case, because we see all sorts of beaches that were not Arribada beaches suddenly becoming Arribada beaches, and increasing in numbers. And so there seems to be this constant waxing and waning of beaches that occurs, and that is just part of the cycle of the Arribada beach.
How much of it do you think? I mean, I found it pretty interesting to see in I think your IUCN assessment of the olive ridleys. You had a series of tables, maybe in one of the appendices, where you kind of calculated the percentage increase or decrease in a beach. And at Escobilla in Mexico, one of the larger, if not the largest, Arribada beaches, where there's been historic, I mean, sort of killing of and potentially not sustainable and kind of unarguably not sustainable killing of the sea turtles there in mass. I mean, that beach still was increasing. It doesn't seem like there's been a decrease there. So how much of this is due to, I mean, how much of an impact can people have on the Arribada?
Yeah.
It's mostly a natural shift.
Yeah, well, Escobilla is a great example of an area that was overexploited. And so there was a huge market for luxury leather in the world, really, that relied on crocodilians. And when crocodiles became scarce and out hunted, people turned to olive ridley leather to supply that luxury leather trade for boots and handbags and things like that. And so the olive ridley in the Eastern Pacific Mexican beaches were the targets. They were being taken all over the Eastern Pacific, but Mexico was the biggest place, and Escobilla was sort of the central point for that industry, because there was a slaughterhouse there, and females were taken from the beach, and mating turtles were taken from the waters near the beach. And there were millions of pounds of turtles that were harvested by that slaughterhouse. Those slaughterhouses were only closed recently in my lifetime. And so first and foremost, the Mexican government realized they needed to protect those beaches and protect the nesting females at the beaches. At Escobilla and other beaches in Mexico too. And they closed the egg harvest at their beaches. But it wasn't until many years later that they closed the actual harvest of other turtles from the water, right, for the leather trade. And so those two actions alone resulted in the decimation of olive ridleys at Escobilla. And then the conservation actions to protect the eggs, the hatchlings, and to close the slaughterhouse facilitated the increase at Escobilla. So Escobilla's enjoying really good times right now, and that's because there is no longer a legal take that's occurring there.
Okay. So there was sort of a historic decline, and it's now kind of rebounding because of those protections.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about it, that as soon as you stop, harvesting eggs and harvesting adults and provide that protection at the nesting beach and in the water, that sea turtle populations can rebound. So, Escobilla is another success story, and it's all thanks to, colleagues of mine from Mexico who were working for the government and pushing for those protections, and also people in other countries who were pushing the Mexican government to cease the slaughter and take of eggs. So yeah, Escobia is another great conservation success story.
That's awesome. There's a great account of that for anyone listening in the Tales from the Thebaid of sort of Peter Pritchard's travels there and sort of the drama that unfolded with the slaughterhouse and such. That it's interesting to think about it from the perspective of the biology of the turtles, and then to take Dr. Pritchard's perspective from the more human side, and to see all different dimensions of that. Thinking about the sort of evolution of the phenomenon, um, why it exists in the first place. I mean, we've touched upon this a bit, but what is the fitness effect of this? Because it seems like a lot of the beaches, very few hatchlings actually make it. It seems sort of counterproductive to the goal of producing more of yourself.
Yeah, so if we go back to my story about my first field season in 1990, if you recall, I put transmitters on turtles in September during the September arribada, and that was a big arribada. Tens of thousands of females laid their eggs that month. And as I mentioned, it rained a lot, and there was no arribada in October. And the lack of an arribada in October meant that there was no disturbance to those nests that were deposited in September. And by the first week of November, there was the most amazing hatch of sea turtles I have ever seen in my life. For 10 days and nights, nonstop, there were hatchling ridleys coming off that beach and entering the Gulf of Papagayo. And I spent 3 more field seasons down there and never saw anything like it. So I think that there are these pulses, and where you have the right conditions, like we did that October, where there was no density-dependent mortality or very little density-dependent mortality after those eggs were laid in September arribada. And that allowed a lot of hatchlings to get out that one year. And so it may just be, those rare but fairly frequent phenomena that keep the population going. So I thought that was a really cool event. We witnessed, and you only witness those sort of things if you spend a lot of time living at your field site. And so, having the ability to spend 6 months at a time and to see an arribada occurring just about every month, you get to observe that behavior. And there was no other time when I saw that same high density of hatchlings emerging. And so the other months and the other years were poor hatching, and but there was hatching still occurring. And so I don't know how many hatchlings you need in order to keep growing your population, but clearly, if there's only 20% productivity at a nesting beach, is that enough? I don't know. Does it have to be 50%? Well, it seems intuitive that 50% would be better than 20%. But if that 50% is not reaching adulthood, then does it matter? So, I just think that there are too many unknown factors about what happens after sea turtles enter the water. And that life cycle takes them in all sorts of places, and some of them survive to adulthood and some of them don't. And so how many hatchlings do we need in order for the population to continue to grow? We've always just gone with, well, more is better.
Right.
Right. So, if it's only 25% production at a nesting beach, maybe that's enough.
Well, that sort of leads into another interesting question, the conservation aspect. I mean, is this something that is the Uribata phenomenon something that should be protected, or is it something that should we let nature kind of take its course?
Well, I think we should protect all sea turtle nesting beaches from any kind of illegal activity. And in a case like Ostina, where there is a legal harvest, I think we should have safeguards in place to ensure that it's not over harvested. But I think we should let arribadas take their course. And I think that, and this is controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, I think we have overmanaged sea turtles in some places, and the Kemp's Ridley is a great example of that. The current management of Kemp's Ridley sea turtles in Texas is to take all of those eggs that are laid on Texas beaches off the beach and put them in the styrofoam boxes and incubate them in a facility where they're protected from predators. And I think that was a great strategy 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. I think now we've got a sufficient number of Kemp's Ridleys nesting at Rancho Nuevo, Mexico, and in Texas that we don't have to intervene in that way anymore. And so I think that at some point you need to let nature take its course. I think that with climate change, we need to recognize that places where sea turtles nested and were successful in previous decades may not be the places where they're going to be successful in the future. And I think that sea turtles know where they need to go to lay their eggs, and we need to let them do that. And I'm not saying don't protect the nests once they're in the sand. That certainly is desirable, especially in places where cars are allowed to drive on beaches and where there are lots of people and dogs and predators. But I don't think we should be managing them to the point where we're making decisions about where they need to go and where they don't need to go. I think we need to let sea turtles do what they've done for millions of years, because they've done a pretty good job of it.
That's a interesting perspective, and yeah, I think that sort of makes sense in a lot of ways. Perhaps I'm sort of curious about what you think about the odds of an undiscovered mass nesting occurring in the sort of eastern Atlantic, potentially in Africa. I mean, that seems like an area where there hasn't been as much research, and I think that a lot of that is just because of the situation there. It's sort of tougher to access, and in a lot of cases, there's it's just sort of limited resources at the present time. But do you think that what is there to learn still in that particular area, and how do we sort of increase the ability for local people there to sort of get involved with research and conservation of Ridley turtles?
Well, I think that there are certainly places where sea turtles are nesting, potentially in large numbers, that are not yet known to the scientific world, and are known perhaps to the local communities that live near those animals. And Africa is a great example, but I'm sure there are other places as well that are yet to be discovered by the Peter Pritchards of the future. And I'm sure we'll learn about more of these beaches and aggregations in the coming years. I think that there has been a lot of emphasis on building capacity in Africa among the sea turtle community, and In fact, the next international sea turtle conference is going to be, I believe, in Ghana. So that's pretty exciting, because when you bring an international conference to a country, you inspire, you engage, you connect with and educate local people, and train local people, and encourage local people, and then you learn more about that country and its resources, and the people are inspired to share that and do more as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that particular region in the future, and hearing great stories about people going out in the field and making exciting discoveries that need to be made. There's still so much we don't know about our natural world that we're learning every day, and I have no doubt that we'll learn a lot more about sea turtle aggregations in other places in the years to come, and hopefully there'll be another person who will pick up the torch and write Biology and Conservation of Ridley Sea Turtles Part 2. So we can get an update on what we've learned since my book was published in 2007. And there have been a lot of great studies that have been done, and a lot of great discoveries that have been made, and yet there's still so much to learn, and especially about the arribada phenomenon, which we're really no closer to understanding now than we were when I was a graduate student in 1990.
Yeah. Well, one other thing that is sort of a pressing question, and at this point we've asked a lot of different people this. This is kind of instigate. I've thought about this a good deal, but a professor I had in Costa Rica brought this up, and I couldn't really come up with a specific answer. But I'm curious with regard to leatherbacks, they're kind of doing the opposite, especially in the Pacific, and there seem to be these precipitous declines there. I'm curious what you think. Why is it that leatherbacks in particular are doing so bad in the Pacific and maybe globally?
Yeah. Well, the situation with the East Pacific leatherback is dire. And I did have the opportunity to study them during my postdoc with Dr. James Spotilla at the Playa Grande Beach, where he has studied them for decades now. And I think that there was a scenario where there was too much take of the eggs. And at the same time, there was a significant take of eggs all along the coast from Mexico down into Central America. There was also significant mortality of adults, particularly in longline fisheries. And so that lack of recruitment into the population from the nesting beaches, in addition to the decimation of adults and subadults in the longline fisheries, was so prolonged and so pronounced that it got to a point where even serious conservation actions at the beaches to protect every nest was too little too late. So for the Kemp's Ridley, we almost got to that point. It was almost too little too late. But there were enough eggs. There were enough adults and enough eggs still being produced at Rancho Nuevo to start building back that population. Slowly at first. It was very slow at first. And I don't think there were enough nesting female nesting leatherbacks surviving by the time that Jim Spotilla and many of his colleagues from Mexico and other countries put in place some serious conservation programs to protect the eggs and the hatchlings. And even though they did that, there was still significant take of adult leatherbacks in longline fisheries. And so, yeah, it just was too little too late is my feeling about that.
It seems like sort of being hit from all angles is kind of a unfortunate scenario for East Pacific leatherbacks. The hatchling mortality, the probably juvenile mortality as well, and adults,
Yep.
yeah, particularly targeted. So, yeah, that's an interesting subject to sort of touch upon and think about why those turtles in particular are faring so poorly.
Yeah, I spent a year in a pre-doc fellowship working for the National Marine Fisheries Service on longline fishing issues specifically, and the sea turtle take in longline fisheries, and it was significant, and still is significant in some places in the Eastern Pacific and elsewhere. And a few years after I finished that pre-doc, I went to go work for an organization that was previously called the Center for Marine Conservation and is now called the Ocean Conservancy. And I helped them sue the federal government for not protecting leatherback sea turtles from longline fisheries. And as a result of that lawsuit, the judge closed over 1 million square miles of ocean to longline fishing around the Hawaiian Islands.
Wow.
And it was, it's sort of the largest legal conservation victory surrounding an endangered species at that time. I don't know if it still is the largest, but at that time it was. And that set into motion a lot of changes at the National Marine Fisheries Services, and they began supporting a lot more work in the Eastern Pacific to better understand the interaction between sea turtles and longline fisheries, to work with fishermen to get them to use practices that were less detrimental to sea turtles, and also to support more conservation and scientific study of sea turtles in the Eastern Pacific. So that's a good thing that resulted from that effort. And eventually that area of the ocean was opened back up to fishing, and now there are limits on how many turtles can be taken. But at the time that I was working for the Fisheries Service, I can remember getting into a heated argument with one of my colleagues because they estimated, based on some model, that there were going to be 42 leatherback turtles taken by the fishery that year. And I said, well, how do you know 42 turtles is not too many? And he said, well, how do you know 42 turtles is too many? And it was basically, things were done back then by the federal government in a way that, in my opinion, was not biologically prudent, did not err on the side of caution. And things are much different now. And as a result of lawsuits and just the evolution of the agency and the issues, they take those things a lot more seriously now. And so that's why things like stock assessments are important, because takes are allowed to occur. And it's the federal government's job to put limits on takes. But if you don't know how many takes can occur before something becomes threatened or endangered or extinct, then, it's arbitrary. And so I like to tell people that, it used to be very arbitrary how decisions were made on how many turtles one could take and kill and be allowed in fisheries. And it's a different time now. And so I think those things also contributed as well.
Well, hearing about that sort of raises the question for me of, what was it like? I'm assuming being involved with that, you sort of interacted with a lot of fishermen and people that's kind of their livelihood. I mean, that's got to be a bit tense, when you're going out and arguing for the protection of a species and potentially from the perspective of the fishermen, maybe kind of making that activity harder for them. I mean, but I imagine you have to be sort of friends, you can't create enemies because that's not going to make
Yeah.
things sort of work out. I mean, what is it
Yeah.
like to interact? What was that like?
Well, after the Hawaii fishery was shut down, I did receive death threats, and that was unsettling.
Oh my gosh.
People calling me at work and threatening me and my family, and that was another one of those moments in my career, much like the Ostianel moment, where I realized that I was impacting, my judgment was impacting somebody's livelihood, or it could potentially impact somebody's livelihood. In the case of Ostianel, but certainly did impact somebody's livelihood in the Hawaii long line decision. And who was I as a non-Hawaiian to do what I did and think how I thought and put turtles before people. And so it just made me reflect a lot about the outcome of that action, and that it could have been done differently if there had been proactive people in the federal agency who recognized the problem and started working with the fishermen directly to develop a solution to the problem. But that wasn't the way the agency worked at that time, right? It was not one of those, hey, we've got a problem, help us solve that problem kinds of relationship. It was a very adversarial relationship at the time. And so, I learned over the years that, I thrive in an environment where I can include people in problem solving, particularly the people who are more knowledgeable than I am about the resource, have a vested interest in that resource, and are interested in using that resource in the future, right? And let's face it, fishermen want to continue to fish in the future. And so they have a vested interest in seeing, the ocean and the resources in the ocean continue to provide for them and their families. And so engaging them in the solutions early on is a really important thing to do. And, saw similar things happen in the 1980s with turtle excluder devices in Texas. I was in Texas at the time. I was, watching as the federal government was going around and proposing the use of turtle excluder devices, and there was a lot of unrest. There were protests. There were closures of some of the major ports in Texas by shrimp fishermen who were protesting the requirement, and it took a lot of work to eventually get shrimp fishermen to embrace the use of turtle excluder devices. And it took decades, in fact. And it could have been different if they had been brought into the process and it had been, a solution that was generated by the shrimp fishermen and embraced by the shrimp fishermen rather than something that was forced on them by the federal government. And I'm not saying that the federal government shouldn't have forced it on the shrimp fishermen. I'm just saying that if there had been time and forethought, it could have gone differently. And it's the same thing with longline fisheries too.
It's an interesting that you sort of point out. I think it's a good leadership quality in general, not just at a federal level, but to sort of go into problem solving from a holistic standpoint and include as many people as possible and not try to sort of sit on a high chair and recruit a certain team and that's kind of sows some division that's not necessary, especially for conservation. But that on the federal scale, kind of from the federal perspective of dealing with the issue of longline fisheries and sea turtles and such, but even at a smaller local scale, I think that it makes sense to just be inclusive. That's important in conservation work.
Absolutely. And, if you don't get buy-in from the local communities, you're going to have a tough road. And I gave you the example of the Wanacasta National Park and Dan Jansen making it a priority to train the locals to work in the park and live in the park and love their park. And, there have now been generations of people he has trained, and they're the stewards. They're the people who are going to, make sure that park continues to thrive long after Dan Jansen is gone. And Dan, did that decades ago before, the rest of us were thinking about the importance of that. And so hats off to Dan for, being a leader in that, as well as, being a great ecologist, and, ensuring that, the place that he loved and wanted to protect will have a future because of the people that he integrated into that protection and program.
We spent a bit of time. I spent a bit of time at Guanacaste, the national park there, and definitely his influence was sort of felt throughout. And a lot of the courses I was taking at the time, he came up in everything in a different scenario. So his impact is wide ranging. I was disappointed. We visited the actual. We were fairly close to Nancite, but like you said, the hike there is pretty. It takes a decent amount of time, and couldn't do that with a class, obviously. But I was trying to figure out some way to do it, but it just wasn't going to work. But sort of leaves some future activities. Well, maybe we can.
I'm glad you had that experience, because that really is just an amazing experience. Just going to that park and being part of that is just fabulous. It's just another great conservation success story.
Right, and it really is a tremendous place. The biodiversity there and the sea turtle presence is significant, but in just a few hours of hiking, we saw some incredible. I mean, there were bats roosting in some sort of rock overhangs, and all sorts of avian bird life, and a lot of other things that are just, you can't see that sort of thing anywhere. The Anticacia mutualism was really a fascinating thing to see. That was something,
It's really hard to find an intact wild ecosystem and anywhere anymore, it seems. But you can go there and it's just a very special place, and thriving and healthy. And the fact that there's this thriving jaguar population now that has taken up residence and is eating sea turtles is just fabulous. It's the way it's supposed to be.
right. The real natural harvest. I mean, it'd be hard for that to become unchecked.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
So good experience.
Well, maybe we can sort of wrap things up with a few sort of final questions. I'm curious, and anyone who's come on that's written a book or compiled a book, I'm always interested in what are the biggest, most unexpected takeaways from undertaking that project.
Well, I haven't done it again. I did it once, and at the time I was working on that, my editor, Vincent Burke, was with Smithsonian books. And sort of in the middle of my project, Smithsonian decided they were no longer going to do those books anymore. And so my project was left in limbo. And thankfully, Vincent moved on to Johns Hopkins University Press and was able to pick up my book there. But there was this period where I had no idea who was going to publish my book, and I had all these authors working on their chapters, and we had already gone through, first draft reviews, and so I was pretty stressed. And at the time, I was working full time, and I had a daughter who was she must have been about 3 years old when I was just starting the book. And I remember sitting down at my desk one day, and she wanted me to play with her. And I said, "Honey, I've got a deadline. I'm sorry, I can't play right now." And she said, "Where is it?" And I said, "Where's what?" And she said, "The dead lion. I want to see the dead lion." And I tried to explain to her that there was no dead lion. And so I can remember just having a million interruptions just like that with my daughter and work and, Johns Hopkins University Press. And I was just so stressed out because I felt like I was going to fail these people who were contributing to the book and were doing so beautifully and without any pay or anything other than a free copy at the end of the process. And so I was always very stressed out during the entire thing. And it wasn't a pleasant experience because I was stressed out. And, I look back on it now and it makes me laugh that I had such stress related to a book. And if I did do it again, which I'm not even contemplating, I wouldn't have that kind of stress at this stage in my life. But at that point, I wanted to make a mark in the world, and I wanted it to contribute to knowledge, and I wanted it to inspire future generations to study olive ridley sea turtles and Kemp's ridley sea turtles, and that remains my goal, is that it provides, even though it's outdated now, it provides a good starting point for some people to learn about ridley sea turtles and their uniqueness, and that there are still so many open questions about Lepidochelys and their unique behavior, and there's still so much to do. So yeah, now looking back, it was a great experience. And I'm glad I did it, and hope that others have benefited from it.
Well, I think you've definitely accomplished that. I think I've definitely read through it multiple times, and it's certainly brought a lot of thought and about sea turtles in general. And I know a lot of the other folks that help out the podcast have also done that, and many other people. So I think all of that work that was put into it is definitely it shows in the final product. I mean, it's one of my favorite turtle compilations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I was so fortunate to get people like Peter Pritchard to contribute to it. And so, at the time we worked on that book, we really had the world's leading experts on Kemp's ridleys and olive ridleys contributing. And so I think, everybody was happy with the end product. And my former postdoc advisor, Jim Spatilla, wanted it to look pretty, so he contributed a lot of money to pay for those beautiful images that we have in the book from professional photographers. And I think that was really a selfless thing that Jim did, but that's the kind of guy Jim is, and it really dressed up the book quite a bit and gave it life.
Yeah, that's awesome. The front cover is incredible. There's the Ridleys going off into the sort of the horizon. It's and the sun sort of cast on the beach at Auchinal. That was something that was really striking to me, is just how beautiful it is, sunrise and sunset there.
just stunning, just stunning. I hope you get to see an arribada. I've seen about 24, and there are no two alike. And you learn something new every time you watch it. You come up with more questions about the behavior every time you watch it. And the sight, the smell, the sound is like nothing you've ever experienced.
I can't imagine. I mean, yeah, the anticipation. I stayed with a local group. I sort of just landed in Ostinal with no real plan and found a place to stay. And every day I'd wake up in the little. I mean, it was pretty meager, but it worked. I'd wake up and run out to the beach and look, and it just didn't happen this time. But it was a good experience regardless, like you said, just to see that place and to go on the beach and see the eggshells and think about how much those turtles shape that whole system is an incredible thing. It would have been cool to have seen the turtles, but that's for a visit, just a reason to go back.
Yeah, we'll try to get the Nancite during an arribada, and I'm not trying to discredit the uniqueness of Ostinal, but at Nancite, because there are no people there, and because it is an intact wild ecosystem, you see the predators coming out when the adults are nesting, when the eggs are hatching, and when the hatchlings are going out to sea. And the predators really have no fear of people. So you can sit there and really watch natural selection in action, actually, from, the Tenosaur lizards come out and eat the hatchlings. The frigate birds come in from the ocean and eat the hatchlings. The crocodiles eat the adults and the hatchlings. It's just like a party on the beach. And it really is the most amazing thing to watch as each of those predators eventually becomes satiated and then crawls back into the forest with full bellies. And so, yeah, give Nancite a chance, because I think that you'll have a different experience because there are no people there and it's quiet, and just exactly the way nature intended it to be.
That's all. Yeah, the whole ecosystem process sort of playing out. That would be incredible. It's definitely sort of on my wish list.
Good.
In terms of just one more question about your book, I'm curious what sort of instigated um, your urge to write that? I mean, where did the idea come from?
So at the time, there were other books that were recently published or in production for sea turtles species compilations. So there had been a biology of sea turtles book that had been done by Jack Music and Peter Lutz, and then there was this effort to compile books on the individual species. And so there was I think the first one was a green sea turtle book, and a loggerhead sea turtle book were the first ones that were launched. And it was, the brainchild of Vincent Burke, who then was at Smithsonian, to do a book on each of the species. And so, after I saw the green turtle book launch and the loggerhead turtle book launch, Vincent and I had a chat, and I told him I wanted to do one on Ridley sea turtles, and he said, "Okay, let's do it." And so it was really his vision that there was a need and an audience, and so I ran with that baton, and thought that, given my experience early on with Kemp's Ridley sea turtles and later on with all of Ridley sea turtles, as a Ridley person, it would be the right opportunity for me. So, yeah, very, very fortunate and happy that I had that experience. And people have associated me with that book for years, and I never really thought at the time I was working on it how important it was to put that together.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting story. I didn't realize it was part of the sort of the group of species accounts, but that makes sense, sort of in context. Well, I'm curious from just what your most memorable encounter with a Ridley sea turtle has been, or a sea turtle in general, the thing that just stands out in your mind.
Oh God, there have been so many of them. Well, I've told you about a few of them. The swimming with
Right.
thousands of sea turtles as they were um, crawling or about to crawl up on the beach. Um, I guess I'd have to share with you um, something that is more recent in time, and probably something you and others have seen on YouTube. My graduate student, Dr. Christine Figner, was doing her PhD research in Ostina just a few years ago, and she was out on a boat offshore Ostina, and they were catching eating turtles and sampling the turtles, and she was measuring turtles and tagging turtles and getting blood samples from turtles, and she noticed one of the male turtles that she brought on board had something in its nostril. And so she started tugging at it, and she turned on her video camera, and as they were tugging on this thing in the turtle's nostril, they thought at first it might be a barnacle. And it turned out, as they pulled it out, it was a plastic straw. And so she filmed that whole extraction of the straw in the sea turtle's nose, and gave me a call when she got back to land, and she said, I've got this really disturbing video, and I want to put it on YouTube, and I'm just not sure about whether I should do that or not, because it's going to be quite controversial. And I said, what's controversial about that? She said, well, the turtle's in a lot of pain, and it starts bleeding when I pull the straw out. And I said, that's the reality of getting a straw up your nose if you're a sea turtle, is that it's painful and can hurt you. And I don't think we should be shy from sharing that with the world. And so that night, it took her, I think, 8 hours to upload that video to YouTube because she had a slow internet. And within a couple of days, it had been viewed by millions of people. And
Wow.
It was heart-wrenching, and still is heart-wrenching to watch. And that was, another one of those points in my life where I had interacted with sea turtles and plastic. They were either eating it, or they were defecating it, or they were inhaling it, as this one was doing. And so that's an unfortunate, memorable experience that I have had with sea turtles on multiple occasions, but it speaks volumes about the environment in which sea turtles and other marine wildlife live today. And so yesterday was World Oceans Day, and this week is Sea Turtle Week, and these things that we leave in the environment and pollute our environment with are impacting sea turtles and our ocean wildlife to a great extent, and will continue to do so until we find solutions to the plastic problem. And so, I wish I could end on a positive note. I guess the good news is that sea turtle populations in general are doing pretty good in many places, but the plastic in our oceans will continue to threaten them until we find a solution to the plastic problem.
Right. That is certainly plastics, and that's a huge issue now, and something that's so much force behind it, and the quantity. It's kind of overwhelming to think about any possible future where that issue kind of gets resolved. But I guess as sort of a last thing, it's thinking about the problems that there are. A lot of times, I think collectively people need a reason to to make a change or a difference. And so why is it that people should care about Ridleys and sea turtles in general?
That's a good question. My aunt who spent most of her adult life living in New York City asked me that same question when I was in graduate school. She said, "Why should I care about the sea turtles that you're studying?" She said, I'm not going to eat them, and I don't depend on them. And, I didn't have a sufficient answer for her then. I'm not sure I would ever have a sufficient answer for somebody who lives in an urban environment who may not have an appreciation for our natural world or understand truly the interconnectedness of humans with the environment. And so I think that you have to show people the video that Christine took of that animal suffering, to get them to have an emotion, to get them to feel, to get them to want to do something differently, and also to get them connected to the real world beyond our urban areas and suburban areas. And that's hard to do. That really is hard to do. And I think it's grown increasingly more difficult with technology.
Right. But it does seem that there are some positive aspects, such as the video and just sort of reaching different audiences. But the amount of information that's out there is tough to sift through and can be overwhelming at times. And it's expedited the amount of damage that can be done. So it's that's it's always interesting to hear different perspectives on sort of the why. Well, the last question that we like to end off on is, a lot of people that listen to the podcast are younger students, looking to sort of make turtle work a career. I'm curious if you've got one or a few pieces of advice you think that the next generation or people looking to make turtle work a career should know.
Well, I always like to answer that question first by saying, don't let anybody discourage you, because there are a lot of people out there who will say things like, there are too many people studying turtles, or, you're not going to make any money, or you're not going to find a job, or, you're not going to X, Y, or Z. And just tune them out. If I had $1 for every time somebody told me I wasn't going to make it, or I wasn't going to get a job, or I wasn't, going to do something to achieve my goal, I'd be very wealthy. And so if that's what you want to do it, and just don't worry about what your mother thinks. Don't worry about what your great aunt thinks. Don't worry about what a professor might tell you can or cannot do. If you have the interest and the passion and want to do it, pursue it. There are lots of great opportunities out there. They're looking for people who want to work hard, who have passion, and who are reliable and dependable. And so if you want it bad enough, you can do it. So don't ever get discouraged, I guess is my advice. And we need you. We need future generations to care about the planet. We need future generations to care about turtles. We need future generations to ensure that that there are good stewards, and that we have the kind of world that turtles can survive in, and persist in, and even thrive in.
Well, I think that's a really sort of a good note to end on. And we like to end every podcast with a quick round of turtle trivia. So I don't know if you have um, a random turtle fact or a Ridley fact or something you want to throw at me and see if you can stump me on with it.
Wow. Okay. Let's see. What is the name of the very enlarged gland that is found in only Ridley turtles? Well, it's enlarged in Ridley turtles. It's found in all of the sea turtles.
Is it the Rathke gland?
Very good. Very good. Yeah. And we still don't know its function. So there's another opportunity for a graduate student to do some really groundbreaking research. All sea turtles have Rathke's glands. It's only the Ridley turtles that have an enlarged Rathke's gland, and it secretes mostly lipid from that gland. And so, yeah, it's there for a reason. We don't know exactly what the reason is. We believe it's communication, but we don't know who they're communicating to or what it's communicating. So, great project in the waiting.
Right, that could have some bearing on the arribada phenomenon as well. I mean, I could see that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I can tell you for certain, based on a sample size of only 10, is that before the arribada, those females have a little waxy plug in the pore of the Rathke's gland that is visible. And then after the arribada, that waxy plug is expressed. So that was a sample size of 10, and would love to see somebody figure out what's going on there. But yeah, that's another opportunity.
Well, that's really interesting and a future project. Well, I think we'll sort of wrap things up there. If you have anything else that you want to end on, feel free. But
just want to wish everybody a happy Sea Turtle Week for those who enjoy Sea Turtle Week and celebrate it. And every day this week there will be a different species that is highlighted and a different conservation need that is highlighted, and it's the most wonderful week of the year.
awesome. Well, that's for listeners, that's something to definitely look into and mark your calendars for that. And just it is sort of get involved with Sea Turtle Week as much as possible and celebrate these incredible animals. So with that, thank you, Dr. Plotkin, for talking to me today. Usually we have some more people on, but it's a bit early today. A lot of people have been out in the field and such. And but yeah, this has been really incredible. And I was, after spending so much time in Oshtinal, or not so much, but a decent amount, I was thinking about the arribadas and all of the aspects of that quite a bit. And so this was something that was really exciting and particular for me. So I'm really grateful that you'd spend the time, and this has been great.
My pleasure, Michael, and I'm so happy you had that experience. It's a great community and a lot of history in that one area. So I hope you get back there, and I hope that you get to see the arribada next time you're there.
I hope so too. It's definitely motivation to get back. So with that, we will see you on the next one.